Welcome back to our creative videos. My name is Loretta Hayes and I am from Hayes Sewing Machine Company in Wilmington, Delaware. And today we are going to do a panel quilt. The pattern is called Hillside Charm and it's from the Rosa Design Company. I believe she named it Hillside Charm just because of the panel that she has in the center of the quilt. However, in my mind, this is literally, I think we should call it border bonanza, because really all it's doing is taking a panel and creating borders around it to create a larger quilt. So if you look at the back of the pattern, you will see kind of without the hillside panel in the middle, that you kind of have a blank canvas from there. What you need to do this pattern is you need a panel that can be trimmed to 23 inches wide and 42 inches long, which gives you a world of possibilities. I am going to be doing the medallion panel, so I can actually hold this up. So, going to be doing this panel here, okay, which is absolutely gorgeous and also has coordinating fabrics, which I'm going to use in the border. Kind of smaller version of the medallions on the panel. But there are just so many different panels. A lot of panels will come 23 inches wide by 44, which is the width of the fabric. So you've got some salvages on there. So we're trimming this down to 41 inches, so you'll lose your salvages, and you won't have any issues with that. So like just a couple of possibilities. This one here is lizards, tropical lizards. We have bees. We have pansies. We have be kind to everything that grows. We have a lovely floral. Tropical again, but rainforest parrots. And then kitties on bookshelf. And those are literally just the things I pulled off the rack in like 30 seconds. So there are more choices within the panels. And you may have some panels at home that you've already purchased that you're like looking at the panel and saying, you know, this is gorgeous, but it's a little too small. You know, it's fine if you're doing like an infant blanket or infant quilt, that kind of thing. But, you know, we want to kind of grow this. And this pattern is super easy and, you know, really just adding borders to the panels. All right, so let's get these panels out of the way and let's talk about our first steps. So this pattern has you cut the first border, which is going to be a solid fabric with 4 squares on the corners. Up. Pam's giving me mixed signals here. All right, so we're going to have 4 frames. So basically a frame with cornerstones. So they cut the frame 5 inches wide. And you could, for the first long ones coming down, you could actually go ahead and cut them as the directions where you cut them 42 inches long. However, we're just going to sew that on the side. So I'm going to come in and I'm going to do the stitching, and then I'm going to go ahead and trim it with a rotary cutter. And Pam, maybe you can pull that for me? I forgot about that. All right. So let's go ahead. I sewed one on already. So we're going to take and we're going to line this up on our panel. And you'll see that our border, I'm actually trimmed up pretty good here. So we've got it going lined up like that. All right, so let's go ahead and stitch. Sewing machine does not need to be complicated. However, for this pattern, really a 1/4-inch foot with a guide is going to be invaluable. We're going to be doing a lot of long sewing, and so this way we don't have to watch the line on our plate. So we're going to come in, we're doing straight stitching, the inevitable. Never ever set this foot up before I get started. I'm sorry about that. So we'll scroll on up. The foot that I'm using is the 57D. So on this machine, we have the ability to have the dual feed engaged. So if that's an option on your machine, go ahead and take advantage of that. So we're going to start out and we're going to line up. And we're lining up 6 inches at a time and just running it in against the guide. And you notice that I'm not doing any excessive pinning or anything at this point. And we're all the way down to the bottom. All right, so you are going to take and you're going to sew on the long length of the panel, on the 41-inch length of the panel, you're going to sew 2 borders. Then we're going to hop up and we're going to press. So when we press, we're going to want to press towards our border, unless we have an issue where we have a really light border and we're pressing the darker panel towards it. If you're doing a border type quilt, I highly recommend using best press on the borders. It gives you a flatter press, but it also gives your fabric body. So as you're building that borders, the borders out and creating a larger quilt, you're not going to end up with a quilt that's kind of ruffled along the edge. So if we press with the best press as we go through, we're kind of firming everything up as we go. So I'm going to take it, I'm going to put the border to the back of the ironing surface. We're going to have the seam allowance going towards the border, and you can run your fingertips down and you can feel that. And then we're going to come in with the iron and we're just going to do little presses against that seam so that we get a super flat press. We don't want to be pressing accordion pleats in. And in fact, oftentimes when I'm doing a border type quilt where I'm doing lots and lots of borders, I will take the time to stop after I've pressed and I'll give it a little tug to make sure that I don't have any accordion pleats. Super simple to repress at this point, but if you have an 1/8 inch accordion pleat on your border, then you've taken up an extra 1/4 of an inch of fabric, and so that's where we get quilts where they kind of go in and out on there. All right, so we've got that pressed. If I hadn't trimmed this up at 11 o'clock when I was prepping this project, we could come over, we could lay, in fact I can trim this one, there's just a little difference. We could lay our fabric, line up the line in the seam, the edge of the ruler along the edge of the panel, and we can trim up whatever's left over. So we get to do that once. Every other thing that we're doing today isn't really going to be trimmable, except for the last border. All right, so we now have 2 sides on. So now we're going to come in and we're going to take and have our panels going at the top. So what I've done, I have a strip of fabric that's 5 by 23, and then I added a 5-inch square to the end of each one of them. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to take and we're going to join up. I think last night I had them like that. Always good to mark these things. And we're going to come in, and I would really, really like to have this corner lined up perfectly. Now the first block is usually never a problem. You could just like sew it and, you know, put a clip in there or that kind of thing. It's the one on the other end that's the problem, because as we're sewing, sometimes we're taking up a little bit more fabric, and we get over to here and we're like 1/8 of an inch off here. So I'm going to take the time for these particular corners to quilt tack them. There's so much contrast between the turquoise and the black panel that if I'm off, it's really going to show. So we're going to go ahead, we're going to do a few stitches across, cut our thread, then we're going to line up the next one. And I did press my seam allowances towards the turquoise on this shorter strip. So I have one seam that's going this way and one seam that's coming that way. So they nestle together really well. And so we'll come in and we'll stitch that. Once we have that done, we're going to come in and open it up and check it out. So that looks lovely. And that one looks great as well. So we can go ahead and we can just get started stitching. Now, we've got those two corners lined up. In a perfect world, these are going to line up exactly the same way because I cut them, 23 inches across. If you are finding that it's not lining up exactly, so like when I press my borders, I obviously stretched my panel a little bit. Take a quick look at it. Whichever side is slightly bigger, that's the side that's going to go to the feed dog. So we're going to put this, I'm going to put my panel side. My panel side has a little bit of a pooch. And so we will drop that onto the feed dog. And by the time we get sewn over here, it would be as if it was always lined up perfectly. So we'll stitch right through the quilt tack. You're never taking the quilt tack out. Just think of it as corner reinforcement. And we're just lining up the edges, 6 inches at a time, 6 inches at a time. I'll grab my quilt tack now, just give it a gentle tug, make sure everything's laying nice and flat, it's laying right in there. Stitch right through our quilt tack. And when you do that on the top, you got to do that on the bottom. So we'll start out by quilt tacking the corners. Check them out. Make sure you're happy with them. That's looking pretty good. Pick it up, check it out. These two are lining up almost perfectly, so you don't really need to have one versus the other. And then off we go down the seam. But you can see how fast this is. And way more interesting on the corners than just doing a turquoise frame all the way around. Adding those little cornerstones in the corners are going to create some interest in our quilt. All right, so we have the first round of our border going around there. We're going to hop over to the ironing board and we're going to press the seam once again with best press, and we're going to press towards the border. So in my case, towards the turquoise. Flip that around and press the other side. So already we're getting a more interesting looking quilt just by adding the frame around our panel. And if you just wanted to grow your quilt, your panel a little bit, this could be a quilt. We could like stop there and be done. But I definitely want this to be a larger panel. So the next borders, so this is border number 1. The next borders 2 and 3, are going to have blocks in it. So initially when the pattern give you the directions for cutout, it asks you to cut 72 5-inch squares. So 5-inch squares are charms. So you could take a charm pack and you could do a charm pack to do your squares, and you wouldn't have to cut any squares out. What I did for mine is I chose all of the colors that were in the panel, and I chose the warm colors because we had kind of a cool border here. Now when I go to the next side over, by changing and doing warm colors, so yellows, oranges, reds, that kind of thing, then I'm getting my contrast between the borders. We want to have some definition there. So when we're doing these, we're going to go ahead and we're going to start sewing. And so they give you the layout, and there's going to be different numbers of blocks. So on this first one, if I count this down, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. So on the sides, we're going to, yes, I can count more than 10.
Good for you.
So on the sides, I'm going to have 2 rows of 11 blocks. When we go up to the top, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, we're going to have 9 and on the top and on the bottom. So let's go ahead and grab some blocks, and let's just do a quick little sew up. And unfortunately, I dropped them all on the ground. So we're going to come in and we're just going to sew our blocks together. So we're 1/4 inch seaming. We're going to pick up our next block. 1/4 inch seaming again. And we continue until we get 11 blocks. Okey-doke. So we'll continue to do that. Pick a direction to press. So like I usually press downward on my first rows and then upward on my second rows. So we'll set those aside, and in the magic that is YouTube, I'll go grab a border. Just stay here. All right, so here's our 11 blocks. And what you will see is that our 11 blocks are going to line up with our side. So once again, I would like this border here, this corner, and this corner here to be exactly dead on. So I'm going to quilt tack those, and then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sew the border on. So I'm going to do border number 2, and then we'll be back and we'll talk about border number 3. Welcome back. We've got border number 2 on, so you can see that we've got the squares going all the way around our frame with the cornerstones. So once again, you could be like, this is the size that I would like, and so you could be done at that point. But no, we're going to make it bigger. So the third border on the pattern has a turquoise strip added to it. So on the side, you're going to take 9 blocks, sew them together, and you're going to be adding a 9.5 by 5 strip on either end. That's going to be for both the right and the left. On the bottom and the top, you're going to have 5 blocks going across, and we are going to add a 14-inch strip. Now, what's wonderful about this is it creates that corner effect on the ends of the quilt. Pam's going to get focused in. Good. So it creates that corner effect on the quilt. So once again, we're going to pay attention to where the intersections are. So like right here and right here, where the blocks and the turquoise is coming together, I'm going to do a quilt tack, and then I'm sewing down the long lengths. So I start on the left and the right side, get those pressed, and then do top and bottom. So we'll get that done, and we'll be right back. And we are back. So our third border is now on to our quilt. Yes, it's a quilt, right? So this one had our blue corners, so you can see how pretty they turned up. So the next step, if you want to make it bigger, because we're going to do a go big or go home kind of situation. So we are going to now take and do the optional border. And I cut the optional border out of my coordinating fabric. So you can see that these have got the smaller designs, and but of the same of the panel. So they give you very limited directions when it comes to the optional border. They tell you that you need 1.25 yards. I went ahead and I cut my strips so that I had enough plus a little bit extra, and I sewed all of my borders together. If you're doing a pattern where you think a seam is going to be a problem, then I would do 8 strips, and I would center my seam in the center of each one of my edges. So let's start out with the optional border. And so we're going to line up. When we're lining up our optional border, because we're no longer dealing with pieced edges, we're going to go ahead and we're going to let about 1 inch or so hang off the edge so that we can square up the corner when we're finished. So we'll line that up, 1/4 inch. And this is really fun because now we're back to not having to line up any corners. We can simply line up 6 inches. So 6 inches. Line up our next 6 inches. And really the only thing that you want to pay attention to when you're doing these final borders is that your quilt is not dragging on the table. So you don't want it to be hanging all the way down. You want to kind of keep it up and loose. If the quilt is dragging, then quite often what will happen to that outside border is it'll get a little bit wavy. So you lay the quilt on your table and the quilt is laying flat, but your last border is kind of you've got a little bit too much fabric. So we're going to work our way along. We also don't want to do the opposite. We don't want to have the death grip on the border. If I'm taking and holding onto that border and stretching that border, we're going to actually gather in our edge of our quilt. So be relaxed with it. These are kind of Zen symbols, so, you know, be Zen. And so we'll come in. And we'll sew down all the way down our edge. And at this point, it's getting to be quite long. Pam, the pattern's over there. Can you get me the dimensions of what it'll be finished?
Sure. With the optional border, it's 59 inches by 77.
So a true twin size bed quilt. So we're coming all the way to the end. When I get to the very edge of my quilt, I'm going to come in, I'm going to grab my scissors, and we're going to cut the quilt border considerably longer, like about 1 inch longer than my quilt. At that point, we can hop up, head over to the ironing board. So we'll spray our best press all the way down the border. And give that a press. So I really like the look of that. That works out really nicely.
Lovely.
So I'm pressing those seam allowances towards the border. So I've got the seam allowance pushed to the back, and we're simply taking that iron and moving that lip up against it so that we get a nice flat press. And the last little bit. So looking good. So you'll do that on both sides. Once they're done, you're going to head over to the rotary mat. We're going to lay the ruler down on top of the seam. So we're going to have a line of the ruler lined up right in that seam, the edge of the ruler on our previous border, and we're going to come in and we're going to clean that edge up. By doing it with the rotary cutter and not cheating and taking and using your scissors and using the back edge of your quilt, you're going to get a much squarer corner. We don't want to get it to this point and have a quilt that's got like ears sticking out, like stretched on the corners. All right, so we're going to go ahead. and disappear again. I'll sew the rest of this border on and we'll be back to show you what it looks like. Welcome back, and we are complete. So we have added our optional border all the way around. So I hope you enjoyed this idea of what you can do with those panels, and we shall see you next time.